My name is Alice, and this is the story of a moment in time that reshaped everything I thought I knew about my life. I grew up in a small, tranquil town, where life moved at an unhurried pace, and familiarity wrapped itself around us like a comforting blanket. My mom was the heart of our home, a woman whose warmth could light up even the darkest corners. She had an innate ability to make everyone around her feel cherished. Whether she was baking cookies for our neighbors with her special sprinkle of cinnamon, or sitting beside my bed, her voice weaving magic as she read my favorite bedtime stories. She was my anchor, and in many ways, my hero. But the year she accepted a new job, everything began to shift in ways I could never have foreseen. This wasn't just any job, it was a big break for her. A prestigious opportunity that made us all beam with pride. Yet, with this success came the catch: frequent travel. Mom started leaving early on Monday mornings, suitcase in hand, and wouldn't return until late Friday nights. Her smile tired but intact. She never came home empty-handed, always bringing little gifts for Samuel and me, trinkets that made us feel as though we had a piece of her adventures. She regaled us with tales of the interesting people she met and the important projects she was leading. First, it all seemed exciting, like we were a family making sacrifices for something greater. But as the weeks turned into months, her absence began to create an unspoken void. The warmth that once defined our family dinners gave way to silence, broken only by the low murmur of the TV. Dad, who had always been our rock steady, dependable, and full of humor, seemed to withdraw into himself. His once frequent jokes, the ones that made Samuel erupt in fits of laughter, grew fewer and farther between. Instead, he spent long hours gazing out the window or tinkering with objects that didn't need repair, as though avoiding something he couldn't put into words. I was 19 at the time, old enough to see the cracks forming but not yet wise enough to know how to fix them. It was around then that I noticed a change in Dad's behavior, a subtle shift at first, but one that quickly became impossible to ignore. He started paying more attention to me in a way that felt different, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. Initially, it seemed harmless. He'd ask about my classes, offer to help with assignments I didn't need help with, or join me in the living room when I watched TV, even if he wasn't interested in the show. But soon, his attention became more focused, more insistent. He began waiting for me to come home from college, his face lighting up when I walked through the door, as though I were the highlight of his day. He suggested outings, trips to the ice cream parlor, drives to nowhere in particular, just the two of us. Meanwhile, Samuel was left to his own devices, his laughter now a rare sound in the house. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he was lonely without Mom around, struggling in his own way to cope with her absence. But a nagging discomfort began to take root in me, one I couldn't shake. The atmosphere when we were alone grew heavier, tinged with something unspoken that made me want to put distance between us. The security I once felt in his presence was being replaced by an unease I didn't yet have the courage to confront. One quiet night stands out vividly in my memory, as though it's etched in sharp relief against the haze of that year. The air was warm, filled with the rhythmic chirping of crickets outside my window. I lay in bed, wrapped in the softness of my favorite sleeping dress, a light, airy garment perfect for summer nights. My eyelids grew heavy, the hum of the fan lulling me toward sleep. Then, a knock at my door broke through the stillness, startled me, the sound so unexpected at that hour. Dad never knocked on my door this late. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it. But then it came again, soft but insistent. "Come in," called hesitantly, sitting up and pulling my blanket around me for added comfort. The door creaked open, and there he stood, his expression serious in a way that made my chest tighten. He rarely entered my room, especially uninvited, and the sight of him there felt like an intrusion into a space I considered my sanctuary. "Sorry to bother you, Alice," he said, his voice unusually gentle. I needed to talk to you about something." I nodded slowly, my stomach twisting as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him with a soft click. He crossed the room and sat down at the edge of my bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. His presence felt overwhelming in the quiet, the air between us thick with something I couldn't name. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to sound calm even as my pulse quickened. He hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment, he looked like a man searching for the right words in a sea of uncertainty. Finally, he turned toward me, his gaze hesitant and heavy. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, his tone unfamiliar. "How's your body doing?" The question landed like a jolt. It was so out of place, so unlike anything he'd ever said to me, that I could only blink in confusion. "I'm fine," I said cautiously, the unease in my chest growing stronger. He nodded, as though to himself, before continuing. "Your mom, she's not around much these days," he said, his voice trailing off into a silence that felt suffocating. I stayed quiet, unsure how to respond. The way he was looking at me, the way his words lingered, made me feel exposed. "I was thinking," he began again, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "since she's not here, maybe I could sleep in here tonight." I blinked, my mind struggling to process the words that had just come out of his mouth. "Sleep here," I repeated, the confusion evident in my voice. He nodded, and then, with an unsettling calmness, he added words that made my heart pound painfully in my chest. "My body," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care. "It's in the mood for a touch." For a moment, I was rendered speechless. My voice caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. The room seemed to close in around me, its once familiar walls suddenly suffocating. His words lingered in the air like a thick, oppressive fog, their implications sinking in slowly, almost agonizingly. "Dad, what are you saying?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice trembling as the question escaped my lips. I shook my head with a mixture of denial and determination, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "No, Dad, this isn't right. Please just leave." But he didn't leave. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he stayed seated, his expression softening into something that resembled sorrow but felt like manipulation. His voice grew quieter, gentler, as if he were trying to reason with me. "Alice," he began, almost pleading, "you're the only one I can talk to. Your mom is never here. I feel so alone." My chest tightened as he spoke. "Dad, you're my father," I whispered, desperate for him to grasp the weight of what he was saying, for him to realize how deeply wrong it all was. But he didn't stop. He didn't seem to care. He just kept talking, weaving his words into a web that made me feel trapped, his insistence growing stronger each time I refused. The air in the room grew heavier with every passing second. My heart raced, the pounding in my ears drowning out everything else. He kept pressing, his persistence wearing down the edges of my resolve. I felt cornered, like prey caught in a predator's snare. And before I fully understood what was happening, he had crossed a line I had tried so desperately to protect. When it was over, I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, my mind spinning with disbelief. My body felt numb, as though it no longer belonged to me. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, that it would never happen again. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I was wrong. It didn't stop. It continued day after day, night after night. He always found excuses, new ways to justify what he was doing. Each time, my fear and shame grew, entwining themselves into an unbreakable knot inside me. I felt like I was drowning, trapped beneath the weight of a secret too heavy to bear. I knew I couldn't live like this. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. That's when I thought of Auntie Grace, the kind-hearted woman who lived next door. She was always so warm, so approachable, the type of person who made you feel safe just by being near her. If there was anyone in the world I could trust, it was her. One evening, when Dad wasn't home, I mustered every ounce of courage I had and slipped out of the house. My heart pounded with fear as I made my way to her door. When I finally knocked, my hands were trembling, and I could barely breathe. When Auntie Grace opened the door, her face lit up in a kind, welcoming smile. "Alice, my dear, come in. What brings you here at this hour?" I stood frozen in her doorway. The words I had rehearsed in my head suddenly caught in my throat. But when I looked into her eyes and saw the concern etched there, the dam inside me broke. Tears streamed down my face as I choked out, "Auntie Grace, I need help." She didn't hesitate. She pulled me inside and guided me to her sofa, her hand resting gently on mine. "Tell me everything, child," she said softly, her voice steady and reassuring. And so, I told her. I told her everything, the words, the moments, the pain I had kept locked away for so long. It spilled out of me like a flood, every detail I had been too scared to share with anyone else. As I spoke, I felt both relief and fear, a fragile mix of emotions that left me shaking. Relief because someone finally knew, fear because I had no idea what would happen next. The days that followed were a whirlwind of whispered conversations and tense silences. Auntie Grace tried to intervene subtly at first, gently bringing up concerns with my mom, but Mom dismissed her worries with a nervous laugh. "Don't be ridiculous, Grace," she said. "Everything's fine. Alice is fine." But her eyes betrayed the worry she didn't want to acknowledge. Then came the night I overheard them arguing, Mom and Dad, their voices sharp and filled with emotion. I lay in bed, holding my breath as I listened. "How could you?" Mom's voice cracked, raw with pain. "She's just a child. You've hurt her in ways I can't even comprehend." Dad's response sent a chill through me. His voice was calm, detached, as if he didn't grasp the gravity of what he'd done. "You've been gone for months. Mercy, don't act like you had no part in this. You weren't here to see what was happening." The next morning, Mom packed her bags and left without a word. I felt abandoned all over again, the chaos of it all suffocating me. But Auntie Grace's words echoed in my mind. "Alice, you have to tell someone. This isn't your fault." With her encouragement, I confided in someone I trusted, a teacher named Mrs. Amora. She listened intently as I poured out my story, her kind eyes never once leaving mine. When I finished, she placed a hand on mine and said firmly, "We're going to get you the help you need. Alice, you're not alone anymore." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her. The morning after I confided in her, she wasted no time in taking action. She reached out to Child Protection Services immediately, her voice calm but resolute. With gentle reassurance, she told me I had done the right thing by speaking up and promised that help was already on its way. Although her words offered a glimmer of comfort, I was still terrified, my mind racing with questions about what would happen next. Her steady presence, however, was like a lifeline in the storm, a reminder that I was no longer alone in facing this nightmare. Within days, I was introduced to a counselor, someone the authorities had arranged to help me navigate the overwhelming emotions I was carrying. First, I couldn't find the courage to speak. Every word felt trapped, as if weighed down by the pain and fear that had silenced me for so long. But the counselor was incredibly patient, her voice warm and encouraging, gently guiding me through the tangled web of my emotions. The first few sessions were excruciating, but over time, the knot in my chest began to loosen. Slowly, I started to open up. The words came out haltingly at first, whispers of the pain, the confusion, and the fear that had become my constant companions. But as the sessions continued, I found myself speaking more freely, each confession feeling like a small victory. Every truth I shared lifted a weight off my shoulders, as though I were finally unshackling myself from the chains that had held me captive for so long. I could breathe again, deeply and fully, for the first time in what felt like years. While I worked through my emotions in therapy, the authorities began their investigation. They moved with determination, questioning my father and gathering evidence to build their case. My father, ever the manipulator, denied everything with a calmness that was chilling. His voice was steady, his demeanor almost unbothered, as if the accusations were beneath him. But the truth was undeniable. My testimony, the murmurs from concerned neighbors, and the digital proof I had saved over time painted a damning picture. It was enough for them to take action. The day the police arrived at our house is forever etched into my memory. It was early morning, and the air felt thick with tension. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions serious. As they approached the door, my mother stood beside me, gripping my hand so tightly it hurt, but I welcomed the pain. It anchored me in the surreal reality unfolding around me. As they placed handcuffs on my father, he turned to look at me. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth I had once sought in them, and his silence was deafening. Our home, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a battleground. The walls seemed to echo with the weight of what was happening. A mix of relief, sadness, and unresolved grief. Relief, because I knew he could no longer hurt me. Sadness, because the illusion of a loving family I had clung to was shattered beyond repair. And grief, because I was mourning the life I thought I had, the father I once believed in. As the police car pulled away, taking him with them, tears streamed down my face. But these tears weren't for him. They were for me, for the little girl who had held on to a fantasy for so long, for the family that had only existed in my dreams. Mrs. Amora, ever the steady figure in my life, placed a comforting arm around my shoulders, and my mother pulled me into a tight embrace. "We'll get through this, Alice," she whispered softly. Together. The trial was a grueling ordeal, one of the hardest experiences of my life. Walking into the courtroom, I felt as if the walls were closing in on me, the weight of what I was about to do pressing heavily on my chest. The thought of facing my father in that room, of bearing the truth in front of strangers, was almost unbearable. But deep down, I knew this was something I had to do, not just for myself, but for my mom, for my little brother, and for anyone who might one day need the strength to stand up for themselves. When I took the witness stand, my hands were trembling, and my voice wavered with fear. But from the back of the room, I could hear my mother's soft encouragement, her presence steady and reassuring. Beside her, Grace, my closest friend and unwavering support through it all, gave me a small, confident smile. I clung to their strength as I began to speak. The courtroom was silent as I recounted the events that had haunted me. Every eye in the room was on me, but my gaze kept drifting to my father. His expression was unreadable, his gaze cold and detached, as though he felt no remorse. It was hard to stay composed under his piercing stare, but I reminded myself why I was there: to tell the truth, to seek justice, to reclaim my life. When the judge finally delivered his verdict, it felt like the room exhaled all at once. The defendant is sentenced to 15 years in prison for his crimes. Those words reverberated through me, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over me in waves. I had done it. I had faced my fears, spoken my truth, and ensured that justice was served. In the moments that followed, I was surrounded by the people who had stood by me. My mom's arms wrapped around me tightly, and Grace held my hand as tears of relief streamed down my face. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that healing was possible, that life could begin again. Rebuilding wasn't easy. After the trial, my mom and I started therapy together, working to mend the broken pieces of our family. My little brother, Samuel, was too young to fully understand, but even he sensed the shift in our lives. Slowly but surely, we created a new normal. Years later, I turned my pain into purpose. I began working with an organization dedicated to supporting children who had suffered from abuse. Sharing my story became a way to not only heal myself, but also to help others find their voice. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving and creating a future where no one would have to face such pain alone. Thank you for taking the time to watch our videos, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Our channel will always update interesting content. Thank you and see you in the next videos.